Okay, I'm just going to run through, because I've had a few questions about this, just going to run through the SCS Pivot that's available as an aftermarket option for the Awesomatix A12. SCS stands for Spherical Contact Shim, so it's just an alternative design of pivot that rather than on this car as standard out of the kit, the outer chassis rolls relative to the battery tray on some plain washers and O-rings which compress when the chassis rolls from side to side. So all this spherical contact shim does is change the car from relying on the compression of a rubber O-ring to being an actual spherical kind of ball and socket type design, which to me mechanically is a more sound design. But I think the reason you don't get this as part of the kit as standard is because it's quite detailed and expensive to make. So it's, you know, if you supplied this as standard in the kit, it's probably going to bump the price of the kit up considerably, which, you know, it's not for everyone. But nevertheless, it's a nice option part to run on the car. It's probably, if I had to recommend one thing to buy in addition to the kit, it is this SCS Pivot. Just makes the car, yeah, mechanically the pivot will work better. The car won't bind up so much in roll, and you can rely on the springs and the damper on the car to control your roll stiffness and damping rather than compressing a rubber O-ring. In terms of what you get when you buy the kit, is really it's just a couple of parts. You get a very small black top hat part, and also a small brass shim which looks like a cone washer, but actually if you were to view it under a microscope or much more closely, you'd see that it's actually got a spherical profile to it. So the spherical profile on this brass washer actually pivots inside this black top hat, and that's what gives you effectively a ball and socket pivot, similar to what you would see on a more conventional design of 12 scale car. Obviously this is much smaller, more detailed, it's very precise and lightweight, which is also a good thing to have. So in terms of how you install it, as you can see, I've got the car here. I've turned the car upside down. I've found that the easiest way to build the pivots on the car is to do it with the car on its back. I've disassembled the outer chassis from the main part of the car, taking the pivots out just to put it in the state that you'll have it on the bench when you start this process. We tend to, in the UK, just run the SCS Pivot in the rearward pivot here. We don't bother running it in the front. It has the most effect in the rear pivot position. And it's important to note that if you run the SCS Pivot, you don't need to use the set screw that goes in the hole next to the pivot hole. So as if you're using the standard O-ring pivot here, you need to fit this set screw to set the float and play in the pivot assembly. But if you run the SCS Pivot, you don't need that. You just need the pivot itself. And it's really, when you come to fit it, just a case of assembling the bits together. So if you take the small black top hat, if you look at it closely, it's got a flat side here, and then if I turn it over, you can see just a recessed side. So we put the flat side down onto the underside of the battery tray, just hover that over the hole that it goes in, then take the brass pivot washer. Now you might want to coat this in some, what I do is just smear it in some like black grease or joint grease of some kind, just to lubricate it a bit. I'm not sure if it really needs it, but it's kind of a peace of mind thing for me to know that there's some lubrication in there. And then you just place this brass shim into the top hat, so with the cone kind of facing downwards into the top hat. So you can see, incidentally, if you want some pretty diagrams and proper instructions for this, they are available online. If you go onto Putty RC, you will see a range of setup sheets, but also the instruction manual for the car and a separate small instruction booklet for this SCS Pivot. So that's probably a useful and advisable thing to have a look at before you do this. So I've positioned the top hat and the brass washer here as it needs to be, and then we've got the top hat, as you see here. This is what's provided in the car kit. This goes into the outer chassis just to hold the pivot screw. So if I just bring the outer chassis in, making sure, if I slide it along, you'll see, I'm just making sure that the wings on the damper are lined up on the pins at the back. So just slot those in there, and then you see the outer chassis will just drop down nicely onto the pivot I've just assembled there. And if we drop that top hat in, just give it a little wiggle, and you just want to make sure it's properly seated in this outer chassis, so it should sit flush with the outer chassis there. If it's sat proud, it just means that it's not engaged with the brass shim properly, so just give it a wiggle. Don't be too hard with it. Yeah, patience is the key here. And then take your short spherical screw, which looks like that, and that just pops in the hole. Get your 2mm driver and very gently just slowly do this screw up. Don't be too hasty with it. Just make sure that everything's seating properly in the hole as you tighten this up. And I can just feel that going nicely tight inside there. And if I take my driver away, I can see everything's sat nice and flush with the bottom of the chassis, so nothing's holding off, nothing's been pinched inside, and I can just roll the chassis like this, and that feels nice. So I know now that everything is properly seated inside here, and that's it. And then all we need to do is build the kit standard front pivot into the car, which we do by taking our grey washer, again provided in the kit. You can just slide that underneath here. This is a little bit fiddly, but I'll do my best. You can use the end of a driver just to work this in. You just want to work it in from the side and position it over the hole, like so. Then take your O-ring. So it has been known for people to use the wrong O-ring in this pivot. So it's a small black O-ring that's I can't remember what the size of it is, but it's the hole through the middle of it is about 4 or 5 millimeters. You can see roughly how big it is on the end of my finger there. So do make sure you're using the right O-ring in this pivot. And I find the easiest thing to do with this is just to slide it through the hole, the aperture in the outer chassis. So if you just pinch it between your thumb and index finger like that, and then it just fits through this hole. And again, you can just poke it in and work it in with your driver. Just line it up over the hole of the washer there. Then take your little top hat, which is the same as the one for the rear pivot. Drop that into the outer chassis. Again, just give it a little wiggle to make sure it seats in there properly and is nice and flush. And then the screw for this pivot is the longer of the two, so it's got a longer thread on it because it's got to go all the way through the pivot into the threaded brace on the top of the suspension plate. So again, when you're installing this, just be very careful with it. Wiggle it in, because what you don't want to do is pinch the O-ring on the threads of this screw. So when you put it in, just be very, very gentle as you tighten it up, just a little bit at a time. If stuff starts to pinch and bind up, you should be able to feel it, so just go very gently with it. And then once you've got it seated, you'll feel the car rolls nicely like this. So then you can just tighten this up. So we just nip that up and just give the rearward one a tweak. That's nice and tight. And there we go, an assembled pivot. Hopefully that's helpful. Like I say, if you want further detail and the instructions for the SCS Pivot, get onto TRC. There's a library of information about the car, including some setup sheets from us guys in the UK, but also our friends in America, and some of our teammates in Europe as well, on various carpet types and grip levels. So hopefully you can find something suitable for what you're running.